Hey guys, what's going on? Now that Easter is about to close out and we're about to commemorate, finish commemorating Easter and the importance of Easter as far as a religious holiday or a religious observance, we'd like to remember an attack that happened 3 years ago on Easter Sunday, and that was the attack on in Sri Lanka on three churches and six hotels done by ISIS. This was unprecedented in Sri Lanka because although Sri Lanka is, well, throughout the 80s and 90s, was a war torn nation, it was never a war torn nation that involved conflict with Muslims. The central conflict was the Hindu minority, the Tamil minority, which were imported by the British during the rule in Sri Lanka, at that time known as Ceylon, of Tamil Hindus from South India, into the country, upsetting the religious balance of the ruling Sinhalese elite. And then there was always Muslims there. Muslims first arrived there in the 16 and 1500s when Arab Muslims and Persian Muslims and even Indian Muslims from the north of India were dominating the Indian Ocean slave trade. The slave trade and sea trade, because there was, or there still is, a contingency of Afro Sri Lankans there that are descendants of slaves. They're called um, Kafars. I know that word is, especially in South Africa, to South African brothers and sisters, that is a very offensive word because of the context of it. But of course, we know the word originates. It doesn't originate from Afrikaans, the South African Dutch language. It actually originates from the Arab traders. So during this time, the Arab Dow period, Arabs were ruling the East Indies, and one of the things they were spreading was Islam. So they spread Islam to Sri Lanka, which would, again, like I said at that time, was known as Ceylon and was important already, even though it was a Buddhist country majority, because India was Buddhist at one point during the Mauryan Empire, and then under King Ashoka, he converts to Buddhism. He becomes a pacifist, and then it seems like the entire country of India is going to be Buddhist. And then all of a sudden, the rise of Shankaracharya, a religious reformer in Hinduism. Then the Gupta Empire takes over, and Hinduism is restored. It was during this time of the Gupta Empire that Hinduism experienced its golden age in India. Even though Hinduism began in India, Hinduism defines the culture of India. Still, it seemed like they were moving in a different direction, influenced by countries like Afghanistan that was under the Kushan Empire that were heavily Buddhist, Greco-Bactrian Buddhist, that India was going to be entirely Buddhist, but not the case. So India, again, under the Gupta Empire, reverts to Hinduism, and the theory goes, these these Buddhists were exiled, and then they became the Ceylonese community, and they moved down to Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka has always been majority Buddhist. But like I said, Muslims came there in the 15th and 16th century. They were traversing the Indian. Um, they were involved heavily with the Indian Ocean slave trade, really forever, but during this time heavily in the 15th and 16th century, and 14th. Going back and forth to Sri Lanka. And there's a legend in Sri Lanka, a place called Adam's Peak. And according to all three religions in Sri Lanka, um, a luminary or a famous figure from their three religions put his footprint there. In Hinduism, they say Ram put his footprint there because Sri Lanka plays an important part in the Ramayan religious text of Hinduism. According to the Ramayan text, when Ram's wife Sita was kidnapped by Ravana, she was taken to Sri Lanka. So when he goes to rescue her, him and Hanuman the monkey, um, he rescues her in Sri Lanka. And then, of course, after after that, you have the 16th century. The the 17th century. During that time, the Portuguese come, and of course, the Portuguese bring Catholicism there, and a lot of people, especially the lower class Hindus and a lot of the Buddhists too, convert to Catholicism in the same way that they converted to Islam. But after independence, after the 1940s, then the British come, right? The 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, the British come. After this, there is tremendous conflict between the and they bring in more Hindus, between the Tamils that they bring in and the predominant Ceylonese government. Two different languages, two different religions, two different customs. For the Muslims, who are called, ironically, the Muslims are called Moors because who came after them, who discovered them, were the Portuguese. And of course, the Portuguese were familiar with, um, you know, Muslims back in Muslims back in Spain and North Africa. They call every Muslim a Moor, even if you were, from a different Muslim country. The word Moor can be synonymous with a Muslim. So that was just another name for a Muslim, a Moor. So when they found these Muslims in Sri Lanka, they called them Moors. But the central conflict of the country since 1983 was the conflict between Buddhists and Hindus, Theravada Buddhists, Indian Buddhists, not the kind of Buddhists like the Mahayana Buddhists in China or the Vajrayana Buddhist in Tibet or Mongolia. There are different sects of Buddhism, just like there are different sects of Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, whatever. So that was the central conflict. But here on this day, in April of 2019, given the global rise of ISIS, given the leadership of Abdul Bakr al-Baghdadi, who Trump later killed, ISIS was on the ascendancy pretty much ever since 2015, really ever since 2011 when we left Iraq. But 2015 was, I feel like, the epitome of their year when they really became a global power. And on this day, they bombed um, 3 churches and 6 hotels. One was the St. Anthony Shrine. So this was pretty much unique, and it was an Easter tragedy. It was like a bloody Sunday. It was an Easter massacre. And sometimes on Easter, when it comes to global conflicts, like the global conflict between Ireland and Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, there is a lot of reconciliation. And even with Sri Lanka, you could say, well, the British exacerbated the issue, like the British exacerbated every single ethnic issue around the world, from the Greek Cypriots versus the Turkish Cypriots, or Indians and East Indians and blacks in Guyana, or Palestinians and Jews in Israel, or Maoris and white settlers in New Zealand, or Aboriginals and whites in Australia, or Native Americans and whites, or blacks and whites in America, or Protestant Northern Irish versus Catholic Irish Republicans, or Muslim Hindus. Mostly every ethnic conflict, even French speakers, French Quebecois against Anglo Canadians, the British exacerbated or took advantage of in order to maintain their rule there. Pretty much, it is the same story pretty much everywhere. They take advantage of an ethnic rift. The ethnic rift could be racial. The ethnic rift could be religious. The ethnic rift could be, not really political, but sometimes it's going to be made out to be political. Like here in the United States, one of the things that they took advantage of in this country was the divide between Native Americans and whites. The British allied with the Native Americans against the whites, both during the War of 1812 and in the American Revolution. So they did the same thing in Sri Lanka. By bringing in more Tamils, they upset the balance of the country that was predominantly Buddhist, right? And then, by giving, depriving the Muslims of basic rights, they upset the Muslims. So when Islamic fundamentalism was on the ascendancy, in the latter half of the 2000s, after the war in Iraq, and it seemed like the Americans were losing, winning, losing, losing in Afghanistan to They gave them more of an emboldened power. And we've seen over the years since the attacks on Muslims. This one Muslim guy tried to um, tried to post something in a factory and he was beaten to death in Sri Lanka. We've seen attacks on the Muslim Rohingya in by the government in Burma, basically a genocide in our time. The Rohingya being exterminated, the Muslim Rohingya being exterminated in Burma, the Muslim Uyghurs being exterminated in Western China. Of course, Muslims completely marginalized and wiped out in um, Tartar Muslims completely marginalized and wiped out in Ukraine, which is something no one is talking about. Everyone is talking about the oppression of the Ukrainians and the oppression by the Russians and the attempted reunification of the Soviet Union, but the Muslims were oppressed there as well, just like they were in Sri Lanka. But it was uncharacteristic of Sri Lankan society because Muslims in Sri Lankan society were like, relatively integrated. One of the differences, one of the causes of problems um, when it comes to that leads to Islamic fundamentalism and leads to the rise of fundamentalism among desperate Muslim communities. For example, like migrant Muslim communities like Turks in Germany or North Africans in France or South Asians like Pakistanis, Indians, and Bengalis in England, is that these communities feel marginalized and these communities feel that religious extremism from their home country, be it Pakistan, be it Morocco, be it Algeria, be it Egypt, be it Yemen, whatever. And even here in the United States, with a guy like Anwar al-Awlaki, an American going to Yemen to fight, they feel like, you know, they're marginalized in their society. They lack access to resources, and they feel like the way to lash out and the way to destroy, get back at Western society for treating them so horribly as migrants or descendants of immigrants is to attack, either the West or its non-Muslim allies. Now, some will say, well, of course, they're commanded to by the Quran, Surah 9, they're commanded to attack all believers. Not necessarily. Because, see, here in this instance, in Sri Lanka, they didn't attack Buddhists, they didn't attack Hindus, right? They didn't attack the two predominant religious communities in the country. They attacked Christians. So that was a direct, an indirect attack on the West. That was part of ISIS war against the West for occupation in Syria, occupation in Afghanistan, and occupation in Iraq. Like I said, it was appearing that even at that time, before the pullout, that America was losing in Afghanistan. That we weren't gaining hold in Afghanistan. The Taliban was coming back, and um, terrorist organizations like the Jamaat Islamiyah, which even struck in the early 90s in places like Trinidad, were rising to power in South Asia and trying to dominate in South Asia. So that's what this was a part of. And it's a shame because Sri Lanka is such a beautiful and multicultural society. You go there, you see Buddhist temples, you see Hindu temples, you see and older Buddhist temples, because most of what we're used to as Westerners from seeing from Buddhism is East Asian Buddhism. You go to places like Malaysia, you go to places like Singapore, even places like Indonesia. Those kinds of Buddhists are Chinese Buddhists, or sometimes in this country, a lot of Japanese Buddhists, even in Hawaii, right? You go and you see a lot of East Asian Buddhism, Chan Buddhism, Zen Buddhism. That's the kind of Buddhism, the Mahayana Buddhism is what we're familiar with. But Sri Lanka is one of those countries, like I said, that the kind of Buddhism they follow, the little vehicle of Buddhism, is closer to what actual Buddhism probably was during the time of the Buddha. Remember, Buddhism is a South Asian religion. Buddhism and Christianity have a distinction that they are the only two religions that originated in a place but are no longer practiced in that place predominantly. Christianity was originated in Palestine, is no longer predominantly practiced in Palestine. Most Palestinians are Muslims. Uh, and Buddhism originated in India and is no longer predominantly practiced in India or Nepal. Nepal's the only Hindu kingdom, and India is like the only Hindu republic. You know what I mean? So the kind of Indian influenced Buddhism, you kind of see it in Cambodia somewhat, and in Burma somewhat. But I think you really, really see it more so than in Burma and in Cambodia and Sri Lanka. It's a treasure. It's a treasure. It's a historical treasure because those Indian type of Buddhism, because of Hindu nationalism, and because of the Buddhist religion in India being submerged into the Hindu religion and the rise of Islam, you don't really see um, Indian Buddhism anymore. And of course, the kind of Christianity in Sri Lanka, Portuguese Christianity, many of the Portuguese Christian, I mean, the burghers, the Portuguese Sri Lankan Christians are mixed race because the Portuguese, just like they did everywhere else, just like they did in Angola, just like they did in Brazil, just like they did everywhere else, when they went to these places, especially the East Indies, when they went to these places, they intermixed with the women and they married the women. So a lot of the Christians there are upper class, Catholics there are upper class. But it's interesting how they they say um, Adam, the historical, biblical, and Quranic figure, stepped foot on the Adam's Peak, this mountain, just like the Hindus do with Ram and the Buddhists do with Buddha. Three different, one different place means three different things to three different people. It's kind of like a South Asian Jerusalem in a way. But yeah, that's what I remember. And there are still a lot of repercussions going on in that country in regards to this. Bangladesh, which is a neighbor to it and a predominantly Muslim country, came out and supported them at the time. And it was just a time in 2019 where there was a lot of hatred against Muslims in South Asia and Asia in general. But yeah, I remember that attack. It was horrific, and thankfully the people have been caught. But it's been hell to pay for a lot of the Muslim community in Sri Lanka. A lot of them have left. A lot of them have immigrated to the United States. People that are Islamophobic, they'll point to the case of Rifka Berry, where she was a person, a Muslim, a Sri Lankan Muslim, and she converted, and the family tried to kill her. Those are isolated cases. Of course, we can find that anywhere. But it's really been tough repercussions for the Sri Lankans. Now, there was an incident 10 years before that in 2009 where a Sri Lankan cricketer almost got, I think, almost or did get killed in Lahore, Pakistan at that time. So there's always kind of been that thing. But this was interesting considering it didn't have anything to do with Tamils or Ceylonese. It was a completely different conflict. It was sort of like they were having at around the same time when that young Ethiopian kid, Solomon Tekka, got shot in Tel Aviv. It's like you're always used to hearing, in regards to Israel, Jewish versus Muslim violence. And yeah, they're hearing Jewish violence, but a black and white thing. You know? But peace to those victims. I was just, thinking about that attack, and and reflecting on that and how strange that was that day. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see when my next video is coming out. Love you.